Good morning, everyone. I'm going to go ahead and call the meeting to order. And I guess as by way of a bit of a roll call, I'll start by asking who is on the phone with us? Julia, are you there?
I'm here. I'm just putting it on mute.
Okay. All right. Do we have anybody else besides Julia on the phone with us? Okay. Hearing none. All right. Well, welcome, Julia.
Thank you.
And welcome everyone today for our final subcommittee meeting before the big December 11th meeting before the full board. So this is the goal line is in sight, and today we're going to try to wrap up our work and provide a thoughtful recommendation next week to the full board.
Mr. Chair, can I ask, there was a draft that was sent through this morning. Is there a newer version that people are working off of that somebody could send me, or are we working off the document that was sent this morning?
I think it's essentially the same document with minor tweak. I think there was a typo. But Angela is nodding that she's sending you the final grammatically correct version as opposed to my version.
Thank you.
So, as with the last time, we have a number of empty seats up front, and I'm going to invite members from the back of the room that can't hear me project to at any time step up and join us. Getting back to the purpose of our meeting today, I think this is basically to get over the goal line and get us to December 11th. I think the good news is that there's really not, I don't think, a large body of work left ahead of us. I think we've used our previous meetings to get most of that body of work established out there. I think that the bad news is that, if anything, we probably provided a lot more detail than is necessary, and so there's a bit of a distillation and compilation and right-sizing of the information. Sorry about that. Right-sizing the information that we need to do here. There is one piece of content that I think still is in front of us, and that is the overall architecture here. This horizontal design, kind of the left versus right, begs the questions around collaboration, as we've talked about, and are we going to get the correct level of collaboration? And I think we are addressing that in the organizational design. But the second one, and equally as important, is the whole issue around accountability. And that's why we've asked Ron Saxton to really start the meeting off today by talking about that issue. Because I think unless you can answer that question yes, then I think the whole organizational design kind of falls apart. So we're not going to ask Ron to make specific recommendations and for this group to be making any decisions, because it's really not the mandate of this group. But I think what this group does need to do is satisfy itself that the state does have proper accountability and protection in order to move forward with this basic organizational design. So we're going to start off the meeting by hearing a presentation from Ron, and the committee will debate what we hear. And then we're going to move forward with this document, which is the real recommendation to the OEIB. On this, before we go forward with this, I want to say this does not mean that this is the presentation to the OEIB. It's just a boiled down, concise recommendation to the OEIB. We will pull together a more full presentation to the OEIB next week. Hopefully that's clear. What I mean by that is I think there's a lot of rationale that went into this recommendation that the OEIB should hear. We've had several other meetings, so I will take, Ben and I and Angela will take some of the materials from the previous presentations, including the Leadership Summit, and we'll allow the full board to have the full benefit of all that. Today, what we want to do is make sure that the content, as it's boiled down in this recommendation document, is something that everybody on this committee can unanimously and enthusiastically endorse next week. So that's really what we're trying to accomplish.
Okay.
With that, I'm going to turn it over to Ron, but before I do, just any questions around process or how we're moving forward, Julia or Mary or Ron?
What exactly do you think the OEIB next week will be approving or act? What will be the action item for OEIB next week?
Ben, you want to?
My suggestion is that the committee brings forward, as Matt described, its proposed organizational design, that sort of general architecture of the new organization, along with the rationale that it used to reach that recommendation, and that the discussion and sort of motion, if you will, before the OEIB is to proceed with the development of a legislative concept that is consistent with both the spirit and the actual design that this committee brings forward. I think it is. I think we can kind of anticipate that OEIB members, perhaps like members of this subcommittee, would be reticent to sign on the dotted line for a concept that hasn't been fully realized yet. So the kind of instruction to the governor's office and stakeholders will be to work in this direction to address some of the unresolved questions before coming to the legislature with a more fully realized proposal.
Okay.
Julia or Mary, before we turn it over to Ron, any other questions about next week?
So this is Julia. The only thing that I would add is if we're moving to a recommendation that we just have enough time that we can at least comment back before the final draft is transmitted to the board. If it's something other than today's presentation, that we just have 48 hours that we can look at it and comment on it before it's represented to the whole board, that it's the subcommittee's work.
Fair enough. Okay. Thank you, Julia. I'll turn it over to Ron.
Well, did we lose you, Julia, or are you still there?
No, I was just changing to a landline.
Oh, okay. I don't know where it fits on the 40-40-20 goals, but my PowerPoint skills are clearly not up to yours, Matt. So, you've got the color, I've got the black and white. The context of this discussion, I think, in terms of our governance discussion, is really both, what's the relationship between OEIB and the groups with whom it's entering into achievement pacts, because that's, a key governance question. And then secondly, a little bit of insight into what implications it has for resources and roles and so forth. And so that's really the sort of purpose of what we have here. So Seth, if you go to the next slide. A little just sort of background and how I view this. The achievements are the link between those who provide education and the Oregon public. And I've said it that way on purpose, and I just want to stop there a minute. I think it interferes with a proper understanding of this if you think of the compacts as an agreement between the OEIB and the education providers. I mean, the OEIB is here at the governor's appointment doing this. It's something the legislature says is the policy of the state of Oregon, and the governor said it, and we're here to implement it. So I at least think these compacts are really a compact between people of Oregon and those who provide the education services, and we're just the group that's doing them. So it's the mechanism for doing this. I want to, this notion I put in here about the 40-40-20 trajectory. We haven't talked about this for a bit. We talked about it quite a bit in the spring. But I think we have to constantly be remembering that we actually have a target date out there. We're supposed to be hitting 40-40-20 by a time, and so the compacts, again, are helping us as we measure our progress along the trajectory. So when Seth gets back, he can hit the moving us forward. I'm not going to read all of these. Okay. Let's go to the next one. I know it's a scary word to people, but I think we just have to face up to the word enforceable. these are agreements to do things. The state's agreeing to provide, funding and maybe other things that are set forth in the agreements, provide the support. The education providers are agreeing to perform in ways that are identified. And so if there's no consequence of not performing, there's really no point in putting these together. And so we have to talk about what's the consequence of that agreement and going forward under it. And it's good, as I talked about last meeting, to first talk about there are obviously positive consequences. I mean, the whole, loose-tight arrangement is to the extent providers are on track and meeting expectations and doing the things they agreed to do in their compacts. We want to interfere minimally and basically thank them for doing a good job and reward them and hope they have ever more ambitious goals. And so I think that the consequence we hope is most common, and that certainly the desired one, is a positive one. It's keeping things loose, letting them have their general sort of latitude to do the things the way they do. As I said in here, stay out of the way of high-performing organizations. But we do need to have a continuum of consequences when there's poor performance. So, Seth, let's go to the next one. And the resource question, how that gets raised here, is the causes of underperformance are complicated, and we don't know what they are. We can't write into the Achievement Compact what a consequence will be. We don't know what the underperformance is, and so that's where the staff here, chief education officer and staff or so forth, are going to have to be in the business of diagnosing underperformance and deciding if it's something that can be remedied in an easy way with a helping hand. Is it something that can be remedied just by clarifying an expectation, or is it truly a problem? That diagnosis is going to be really key, going to be the critical step, both to solving underperformance, but also to the program having credibility. People have to believe that there's a fair evaluation of what's being done there, and the proof will be in doing it right. There are also differences. We're talking here about a spectrum from early learning through the university system, and again, differences are going to be they're going to be different for different kinds of institutions and different for different levels along the education continuum, and different for both the kind of causes. So again, no cookie cutters. No, here's we could go through and in a contract kind of way say, if you fail, this is what happens. That's not what I think we want to do. We simply want to say there do need to be consequences. There needs to be an ability to enforce, but it has to be tailored to both the causes of the underperformance and the nature of the particular institution we're talking about. And things like community demographics, economics, so forth. Again, it's not a realistic expectation. I don't think it's been our expectation that every single institution will perform to exactly the same standard. This is a statewide goal, and it's a statewide goal that will see some groups doing better than the average, and some, for fairly legitimate reasons, not doing as well as the average. All those things need to be evaluated. So let's go ahead, Seth. So I put together sort of from different things we've talked about, sort of to me what's a continuum, and this is really more just to sort of at least show my thinking about this. Again, at the top, rewards for success, recognition for success. The second one up here I actually think is probably the most important and most powerful on the whole list, the transparency about results, because that to me to a large extent solves the rest of this. That if we're being very clear who's meeting their goals, who's not, what's happening with key expectations, information is very powerful here, and that transparency will educate students, it'll educate parents, it'll educate legislatures and taxpayers, and it will obviously bring pressure on poor performers to perform better. So to me, that transparency about results, success failures is an integral part of what we're doing, and it's certainly something we've talked about all along the way. The other things that follow there, whether it's the Rudy and team helping arrange for peer support and coaching kinds of things, or whether there are things we do to either provide additional money or withholding money. Again, we've at least held out those concepts, no specifics. The things at the bottom are things we hope we never get to, and if we do this right, we should never get to them. But we do need to understand that an absolute true failure is still going to require some kind of reciprocally serious response. So I think we have to at least identify those as possibilities. That's the end, I guess. So that's, you know, we can talk as much or as little as you'd like, Matt, but to me the purpose of laying this out is, first, we do have to understand these compacts are more than just, you know, hollow promises. We expect the education provider to do what they're saying they can do, and conversely, educational providers shouldn't be promising to do things they aren't prepared or expecting to do. And then the role of Rudy and his team is to help meet those goals and to do that in a helpful way however possible, and to, you know, and recognize that consequences isn't just about negative, it also needs to be about positive, and we all know that about whether it's, you know, raising a child or, you know, teaching them, that you get a lot more mileage out of, you know, noting the positive things. But no question, it's going to take some resources here as we get into this. I mean, it's unrealistic to think every provider everywhere in the state is going to hit every target, and so there's going to have to be some work here to do the diagnosis and decide what's an appropriate response for each circumstance.
Okay, thank you, Ron. I think again, just to focus our discussion here, because this is such a big topic, and to focus our discussion here, I think there are two major questions for this committee. One is about resources. We're not specifically being asked to build out staff for the OEIB and Rudy's org charts within his own group. I think it's probably sufficient to note exactly what Ron just said, which is that there are serious resource implications to taking this approach. There is going to have to be a diagnostics function and capacity within the OEIB so that we can understand performance for good and bad. And I think that's probably the right level on the resourcing is for this committee to make note of that, and that we do believe that the org charts and the overall organizational design can facilitate that, but that we have to have appropriate resources. I think the second issue, again, gets down to accountability and this question around, does this committee feel comfortable moving forward with the recommendation on the organizational design with regard to accountability? So what I would say is, for the balance of Ron's portion of the agenda today, this committee should really focus on that question. Before we open it up for Q&A, I would also like to invite Ben to discuss just overall the state's accountability and recourse and so forth, and so that, again, it gets back to this horizontal organizational design. You know, what recourse and what assurances does the state have with regard to performance?
So thanks, Matt, and I'll acknowledge first off that I'm really probably not prepared or equipped to discuss in any detail the overarching kind of state authorities and policies with respect to accountability. I think my hope was merely to acknowledge that as this work, and I think it's important work that Ron's helping to tee up for us, proceeds, it builds on and acknowledges the existing tools that the state may have, and I do know, at least in certain areas,
right,
holds with respect to accountability for education institutions. So, for example, a project that I was engaged in, and Whitney as well, over the course of last year to apply for and ultimately receive the No Child Left Behind waiver that contains very specific interventions for certain types of schools and school districts based on performance. It's been interesting for me to learn, coming into this job with less understanding of post-secondary, but learn about the tools and authorities that the state holds over both the community college system and the university system with respect to that touch on accountability in those realms. And so I think an important piece of the work here is to understand what should be the role of the compacts relative to existing or proposed new state authorities. I think you were quite right, Ron, suggested the compacts themselves won't have consequences in them, in part because of this diagnostic phase that you'd need to go through first. But to me, it sounds like the area for further articulation is how would the compacts be used to inform then existing or proposed new state authorities with respect to accountability. And I think as we move down this road, assuming we do, with on post-secondary, with an emphasis on greater flexibility, autonomy, institutional boards, and so on, it will be very, very important to really hone in then on how those universities with greater autonomy and flexibility and governance closer to their communities are accountable to a state and to Oregonians who expect that their investments, at a minimum, are maximally realized to produce results. And I think that's the single biggest piece of work still left for this legislative session related to the governance proposals here.
And it's partly because, that notion that there are legal remedies out there available now, and maybe others that might need to be implemented, but that I at least put the emphasis on things that I think don't require. The notion of just using transparency as a tool to shine lights on good performance or poor performance. The notion that that Rudy and his crew would be able to go in and talk about diagnose a shortcoming and talk about are there resources either from the OEIB or other districts or other education providers, that kind of peer-to-peer sort of a thing. I think realistically most of the remedies are going to be in that realm, not ones that look to legal authority. But
yeah, totally.
Okay, thanks, Ben. With that, I'll open it up to the committee members. Julia, Mary, any further questions for Ron or Ben? Again, as we try to satisfy ourselves that we can move forward with this recommendation on the organizational design, with perhaps some caveats that Ben just outlined, that there is further work to be done to ensure accountability and enforcement. But really, again, trying to answer that question, can we move forward with a recommended organizational design, satisfied that the state's interests are protected, or the public's interests are protected? Mary, I'll start with you.
Well, I think this is a huge issue, and it raises lots of really important questions, and I appreciate Ron putting out a view of how things should be. But before I would be ready to agree to any of the specifics on content, I'd want to know, what are the current, what is the current role of the state relative to this, and in particular, what is that role vis-a-vis local boards? So I'm talking about higher ed now. I'm specifically talking about community colleges. I'm not talking about K-12. I want to know what the current responsibilities and roles are, and from that, figure out whether these proposals take the state, give the state more authority, less authority, the same authority. I think those are questions that I would have to, research and have conversations about before I'd be ready to say I could buy off on this, because I'd want to know what shifts we're making from where we stand right now to what we might be suggesting.
Okay, so I'm not going to suggest I've got an encyclopedic knowledge of all the what's in place right now, but I do know that in 759, where we talked about this changing and creating local boards for PSU and U of O, that we talked a lot about what are the state's protections in this regard, and the general tool or recourse was focused around hiring and firing the president. And so not entirely through the prism of the achievement compacts, but generally looking to say, okay, what is the major tool that the state has, and it's generally around hiring and firing the president. And so embedded within, and there was a lot of debate about this, how do you do that? Is that a direct process, or is it an indirect process where the board has that authority, but then the governor and with Senate confirmation has appointment responsibilities for that board, and that's ultimately where we came down. And so I think, as I answer that question myself, at least for the universities, where I go to look for the tool here is in 759. So in as much as our recommendation is endorsing or building off of 759, I think it's the mechanisms in 759, at least around Portland State and the University of Oregon, that are the main tools that I'm aware of. So
I'm not very conversant with 759. I don't even know if it applies to community colleges, but what I would say is it doesn't. So from a community college perspective, the hiring and firing of the president is the purview of the local board.
Right, so and there's no changes to that embedded here.
Well, okay, perhaps in this, but I thought we were talking about this.
No, what I was saying is this. So what I was saying is we want to move forward next week comfortable with the recommendation that we've got.
Okay, so if this is the document we're talking about, fine, but Ron just made a presentation, and I'm trying to sort out what is the process with which we're going to deal with this document. I think we have to deal with the issue of achievement compacts. I think we have to answer and vote on the kinds of accountabilities that Ron is suggesting. Not today necessarily, but there's a body of work here that needs to be done. I don't think it can be done today. I don't think it can be done by next week. I think it's work that needs to be ongoing. So I was just responding to this proposal that's on the table. I mean, what I would suggest is we say, this is a piece of work that needs to be done. It can't be done today. We need to bookmark it for future work. I haven't even got to the content yet because I don't think there's any point in that, because we need to there's more research that needs to be done, there's more conversation that needs to be had, and if we want to move this today, I don't think we can do both things. I just don't think we've got the time to do it today.
Yeah, I think we're saying the same thing. That was what I was intending to say at the outset, is that our goal today is only to view Ron's presentation as to inform whether or not we can move forward with this today. So in as much as this does not contemplate changes to the community college hiring and firing responsibilities, then I think it sounds like you would be comfortable with that, because we're not proposing a change. This is proposing a change to TSU and U of O explicitly, because we're basically supporting 759. And what I'm saying is the primary recourse to the state was envisioned to be, I would say, an indirect ability to hire and fire presidents by through the board composition that the state continues to exercise control over. Does that make sense? Okay. I mean, I think in part, to step away from this last exchange, I think in part what I'm trying to get to, and the reason why I asked Ron to do this, Mary, is there are those opinions out there that what we've created here with the OEIB is this new super board that's directly managing, all education, and Rudy's got hiring and firing responsibilities, and this is this big power grab and so forth. And I think the horizontal organizational design is actually intended to be very clearly rejecting that model and is a horizontal model. But then it still does beg the question, okay, in that horizontal model that's not this big super board with a command and control and so forth, does the state still have adequate protection? And I guess I think we're maintaining a status quo with the community colleges K-12. There are some changes embedded with the universities, as I've suggested. I think that work was already done in 759. So in as much as we're endorsing 759, we're basically endorsing some changes to the state's protections. Julia?
So I wasn't sure, Matt, if was your question at the level, are we comfortable with the overall recommendation framework, and then have comments on Ron's presentation, or was that your?
No, I think actually, if you answer yes to the first question, then there's no need to discuss Ron's discussion any further. I think if folks are comfortable, or maybe even a yes with certain caveats as been offered, that we are, but I think the primary question here is, are we comfortable moving forward with the general architecture in the straw proposal? And if you answer that, yes, even with some caveats, then I think we can wrap up Ron's presentation here.
So the answer, I think I'm going to want to have more than a yes. So it's yes, but I think, and thank you, Ron, for giving us a framework to think about accountability. I think that I would join Mary in wanting to have a deeper dive. I would want to understand it better of how this would play out in the non-K-12 sector. So I think I have a pretty good understanding of what the mechanisms, both of support and of maybe a tightening of accountability at the K-12, but I don't have a good sense of what that would look like either in the early learning or in the community college, higher ed. So yeah, I'd want to have a longer conversation about that. And the other thing, I think, in the sense that it's an agreement or a compact, that I'd want to see more of the, so that it feels like it has a broader balance if you were looking at it from the provider standpoint. So what are the, sort of flesh out more the supports of what that would look like, so it's less heavy on the accountability that may seem more of a tightening, but where's the, before it gets tight, the enhanced support. So that's the only thing I would sort of say in terms of this discussion, what I would need to see to feel comfortable that we have an accountability framework that I would say is, yes, generally the right direction.
So just in terms of moving forward on today, let me suggest the following and see, Julia, if you and Mary and Ron, you as well, can support this approach. So let me suggest that this committee does support the overall organizational design as proposed or as presented in the straw proposal, under the assumption that adequate accountability measures are in place, many of which are still to be developed, and the first step in developing those accountability measures is to better understand exactly what the accountability measures there are currently in place, as well as what changes are contemplated in LC 759.
Well, I'd say it a little different. I don't think they're in place adequately. I think what we're saying is we need to have adequate accountability measures, and within the framework of what's legally in place now, then an OEIB has some room to develop those. And if something wants to be developed outside what the current legal framework is, that's a discussion that will take a lot more work and effort.
Yeah, that's a better way of stating it. The question is then, can you still move forward with the recommended straw proposal?
I can't, yes, but for instance, today, I mean, this calendar year, this moment, Ben's department has no infrastructure for doing those evaluations of things. I mean, so to me, that resource discussion that goes with it is, to me, a recognition that if there's really going to be accountability for the compacts, even the ones in place today, there's going to have to be more of an infrastructure with some more resources and more focus. That doesn't mean changing any laws or overstepping anything that's legally permissible, but it does mean probably fuller use of legally available tools. And then if it turns out that Rudy or the board think that other tools are needed that aren't part of the current legal portfolio, I think we're going to have to talk about that.
Yeah,
To me, I'd be saying, yes, I'm comfortable going forward, but I think the expectation of the governor, the legislature, whoever's getting this, is that there'll be a need to be further invested in this effort.
Yeah, I think that's well said. And to be clear, that's when I said assuming that there are mechanisms in place. I was looking to the future as you're describing. So I think we're in sync. Julia, can you move forward on that basis?
Yes.
Mary?
Yeah, I mean, we need accountability. The achievement compacts are under discussion, need to be under discussion, and the spectrum of interventions, if results aren't being achieved, also need to be discussed. So I can move forward on a discussion about a recommendation, knowing that we're parking lot the achievement compact discussion, the accountability discussion, but we can't parking lot it for long. We need to get on it.
All right. Well, that's very good, and I want to say thank you to the committee, because this has been a very long and I would say complex discussion here in this committee and elsewhere, and I think we've kind of handled this appropriately here. So thank you. With that, I'm going to shift over to the recommendation itself. Try to get through this. This is there's a lot of repackaging here. And so this hopefully is going to look fairly familiar. And if so, we can get through this fairly quickly and efficiently. I will start with the first org chart. We've seen this before, and I think this will be a good way to communicate the design to the full board. And then the balance is really plowing through what this means in terms of key recommendations. And so I'm just going to plow through it slide by slide and invite comments along the way. All right, so the structure of the key recommendations is I did try to start with what are we trying to achieve here. So everything is, I've itemized key objectives and then what the recommendations are to support those objectives. First objective is scaling up P20 pathways, integration, cross-sector collaboration. As we talked about last time, it's a convenient reminder as to why we're going through all this. I think this is probably as big a reason as we've got. These are the specific recommendations around that. Again, this is all familiar stuff presented in the past. The general logic, though, is that we've got one agency for P12, and that should by itself create some integration, and another one for post-secondary, and then we've got some glue between those two via the HEC, another glue via the OEIB staff. So generally trying to set up a structure here that will facilitate future development of P20 pathways. Again, it's all been talked about before, but I'll stop here and see if any comments or questions from committee members.
Have you had any discussion about whether this is sort of this is the end of the story, or is this a transition step that eventually looks less silo-like?
So a single Department of Education that might oversee everything?
Right.
Yeah, legislators have asked that some of the first questions. So I would say it would not surprise me at all if during the legislative session that concept gets some discussion.
But are we, if we adopt this, do you view us as recommending this as sort of the next step with future steps unknown, or are we recommending this as the ideal structure?
I think I've been thinking more the former. Yeah. The other question that this begs for me is just the scale and the resources behind our Oregon Department of Post-Secondary Education, for instance. And I would say here we are talking about a new department, and as we really think about what are some of the critical functions performed, for instance, by the Chancellor's Office, how much of that might migrate to the Department of Post-Secondary Education. I think that is another level of detail that this recommendation doesn't yet attempt to answer. But that was a specific point of discussion within the Board of Higher Ed 2 days ago within our Governance and Policy Committee. Is there were voices saying you should really think about this needs to get built out. I mean, when it comes to academic programs and funding formulas, I mean that's a lot of work. So don't underestimate that. So I would say there needs to be a much more thoughtful, detailed, dissecting of workflow to answer that. Right now we have a placeholder in the budget, but $1.7 million or something along those lines, but I would say that's what that is a placeholder. Mary or Julia, any questions or comments on that slide?
Well, I agree that there's a lot of work that needs to be done on number 2. I realize that it's in the governor's budget, but what the functions of that new office will be and the connection with the chancellor's office. I mean, where's that discussion going to take place? I mean, is that a staff discussion? Is it a governor's office discussion, Ben? I'm just wondering what role we have in building that out, if any.
So, yeah, I mean, I think this begs the bigger question, which I promised last time I would come back to this committee with an answer to about the process moving forward. Assuming that you bring forward a recommendation to the OEIB next week, and the OEIB sees fit to endorse moving forward in that general direction, the focus of kind of the organizing focus for the ongoing work will increasingly shift to the legislature and to legislative committees. And so we would expect that governor's staff will work with legislative committees on a calendar for the development of the legislative concept, which would address these details. The actual work, the consideration of and sort of plowing through these difficult issues, some of that may be done within the legislative committee structure itself. Some the governor's office will be prepared to work on with groups of stakeholders, with institutions, with our agencies, Cam and George, and so on and so forth, to try to get bring forward well-realized proposals for legislative consideration. My expectation is that this subcommittee and the OEIB's sort of direct imprint on the work really finishes December 11th, in part because the OEIB is simply not nimble enough to deal with the legislative timeline that we'll quickly find ourselves in. And so, we'll continue to engage those of you who are interested perhaps in this kind of work group structure. I look to Matt in particular, but there may be others. But the real attention appropriately will need to shift to the legislature.
Julia?
Nothing additional on my end.
Thank you.
I have a question on 5, co-locate responsibility. What does the co-location mean? Do you mean co-location of university and community college funding allocations, or do you mean that it's going to be located here and someplace else? Co-located.
Located in the same place.
Okay. The two formulas.
Correct.
Okay.
And actually, this proposal anticipates the 3 formulas: community colleges, universities, and Oregon Opportunity Grant, state need-based financial aid.
All right, moving along. Objective 2, enable statewide strategic investments. Again, I would say this is another core reason why we're going through all this. Yeah. I would hope that this is, again, familiar. So the idea here is to really, I think, build out our strategic investment capacity. We've had some initial discussions around what does ROI mean, so we can develop some common language around how we're allocating state investments. again, hopefully this is fairly self-explanatory, but open up for questions. Hearing none. All right, objective 3. Again, this is objective 3, which is not to be, I think, lost, is a big part of why we're doing this, is to try to offset tuition increases by attracting private capital. And not just offset tuition increases, but improve quality, and so attracting private capital while also protecting the public mission has been really, we've borrowed from the work of the legislative work group that produced Legislative Concept 759. And I think the implicit assumption here is that as we've drawn out these org charts, and we've looked to, on the right side of the chart, the governance of the PSU and U of O, that basically this is going to be consistent with 759. So I think that's just been an assumption throughout this process.
Matt?
Yep.
The one thing on this recommendation, I would encourage a somewhat broader description of the objective, because it's my understanding, just from talking to the various people in the university community, it's not only to increase private investment, but also sort of the nimbleness of a campus to, in their own functions, be able to either capture efficiencies, operate more effectively.
So Julia, that's objective 4.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah, so I completely track with you, but it's I think those are 2 separate reasons why we're going through all this.
Okay, I'm just looking at objective 4.
Can we stay with objective 3 a minute? Is that okay, Julia?
Pardon?
I wanted to stay with objective 3 a minute. Maybe it doesn't belong here, but the notion of increasing private investment while protecting public mission, to me at least, raises the question of private investment that's not in the public institutions. You know, is it part of this discussion to be trying to increase private investment towards 40-40-20 as opposed to just private investment in government institutions, which is the whole, independent school question, who I still think are part of the vision and need to be part of the vision. And it's not necessarily a governance question, maybe. So maybe it's a good issue, but wrong place for the discussion. But at least the words trigger that question.
I think that's said very well, which is it's a good issue. This really wasn't what this was addressing. And what I'm pausing on is to think, should our committee address that important issue elsewhere? This might not be exactly the right place. I did not really think of that in the scope of our mandate. It seems, but I do agree. It's certainly an important OEIB issue.
Okay. I'm comfortable accepting this isn't the right place for it. The words just triggered the thought.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if we might consider merging objective 3 and objective 4.
I think they're totally different.
You do?
Yeah. I think, and I say that as a person that spent 3 years on this and debated, heard all the debates. I think the question here is, Mary, even if you rejected the thesis in objective 3, in other words, there are people that say you're not going to raise another nickel by doing this. The question then is, would you still do it? Which is what Julia's point is that there's a supplemental or an additional thesis that the university will just run better. And so that is why I think you break them out, because they really are 2 very distinct objectives. It's one move, it's one recommendation, which is establish the boards, but I think there's certainly 2 different objectives. And I think the other point is that I think we do need to punctuate and objective 4, the fact that we're not contemplating changes to the local boards for the community colleges and K-12. I mean, I think that's something we could hardly be too explicit about. One thing I will point out under recommendation 3, under objective 4, and again, speaking about punctuating. You need me to speak up?
Yes.
Oh, okay, yeah, if you don't mind, Seth, thanks. I think it does, we haven't really spent a lot of time on this in this committee, but I think under objective 3, I mean, I do think it's worth making the point that if we go through this, the mission of that board for the remaining OUS schools is going to be fundamentally different than what it has been heretofore. This will really be about a dedicated focus on university governance. So in as much as you're shifting a lot of those statewide functions over to the OEIB, what's left is going to be a much more focused board and focused staff on running those universities, which I myself would say is a good thing. And that is a point that came out specifically out of the Tuesday meeting of the Board of Higher Education's Governance and Policy Committee, and I think that's worth stating here. Objective.
I cut Julia off on a question about objective 4, so Julia,
I don't know if you. Yeah, okay. Julia, did you have anything else?
No, I had a chance to review that. I had looked through the deck before, but then I saw that this freestanding, and I think they combined. I just want to give you a heads up. I'm going to be off the call for like 15 minutes. I had something that I couldn't reschedule, so I will not be leaving, but I'll be putting it on mute, and I won't be responding.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, objective 5. I would describe as perhaps the weakest slide in the presentation. It was basically
the most questions, or I have the most questions. So
yeah, I mean,
basically
the logic here is, I do think there needs to be a counterbalance between on objective 4. What we're trying to do is really increase flexibility and innovation on the right side of the chart. And I do think we need to make some statements that we're trying to also at the same time improve the effectiveness on the left side of the chart. And so this is basically, Ron, the 8 functions that we identified for the state.
Right.
And I'm just saying that as a placeholder, we need to build out the capacity to deliver these functions. This committee did not attempt to build out Rudy's org chart, but it is a placeholder to say a lot of the things that you were saying, honestly, on your presentation and elsewhere, which is that we need to build out this capacity, and this proposal does assume that we do build out the capacity to deliver on these functions.
But now the chart, the left side of it doesn't say OEIB, the left side says state, and OEIB is one of the pieces of that chart. So on objective 5, when you say build OEIB capacity and so forth, is that a conscious notion that all of these things are at OEIB?
Yes.
Okay, so you're not intending to say build state capacity of these things. You're intending to say OEIB capacity.
Yes, which I'm saying that the OEIB is, in this left-right, is OEIB is basically the agent for the state.
Okay.
On investment and leadership as we've defined it. It's not to say it's everything education, but on education, on leadership and investment, OEIB is the ultimate authority. We then, on behalf of the state, need to build out these capacities.
I guess I'd be more, I don't know if you think there's anything more to these other than listing them sort of for things to do in the future, or if you're thinking this recommendation. But I still think these would make more sense to me if it was that OEIB should build leadership capacity, or OEIB should build strategic investment capacity. Because I don't, at least the B in OEIB is the board, and I don't see a lot of these things residing in the board members itself.
That's a good point.
It may be our job as OEIB to assure that these things happen.
Yep.
And whether that's empowering Rudy and his team or whether it's empowering somebody else on the chart, it may be our job as OEIB to kind of make sure it gets done. But I don't see OEIB members themselves being the ones doing this.
I think that's a good point of clarity. I will say when I wrote these, I was thinking more of OEIB staff because, and I did find it, so we have OEIB staff. And so that's mostly what I was contemplating was building that out.
Yeah, we have just a sort of semantic challenge here that we've experienced with the Oregon Student Access Commission too, where the name of the agency that describes the staff is the same as the commission, which sort of leads the staff. So we're I think saying the same thing.
Okay.
Chair Don.
Yeah.
And I'll just add, I think this is very consistent with the strategic plan that Rudy will be bringing to the OEIB in terms of both function, but also in having the OEIB as an agency, the staff function, sort of ultimately responsible for ensuring that the state agencies are aligned along these sort of functionalities.
Okay. So I got lucky. Rudy and I will be singing off the same sheet. So we probably can improve the language here because I don't want this to confuse that we volunteer board members are going to be, performing all these functions. I think that's a good catch. Objective 6. This was intended just to describe what the little thinking there was behind the shared services enterprise, and I don't mean to diminish that. It's just this is a very early stage concept, but just basically identify what we're after here. So here's the objective, and then really the recommendation is a real further exploration of this potential opportunity, and then with a nod towards emphasizing opt-in and considering co-op governance structure, which I think were pretty interesting ideas that came out of our discussions.
And what's been the discussion about why that enterprise is sort of unique to post-secondary instead of something that should be servicing the continuum?
Actually, the chart just hasn't been updated. Since you made those comments last time, Ron, I've actually been, in my verbal, I've been communicating that should be considered for beyond post-secondary. So I think that we can better reflect that in the org chart. Objective 7. Streamlining, aligning staff to improve workflow, cost effectiveness. Again, we discussed this at the last meeting, so hopefully this is not not unfamiliar. Welcome any comments. Okay, hearing none.
Matt, just on the question of names, which I don't think we want to spend very much time on, but your previous proposal that this subcommittee saw renamed the OEIB, the Oregon Education Investment Commission, and suggested that the sub-commissions would be also titled, so Early Learning Commission, Oregon State Education Commission, Higher Education Coordinating Commission. Just had a couple of conversations internally to the governor's office, particularly, so early learning has, the early learning kind of reform agenda, which has already been adopted with respect to these governance changes, has been a very intentional effort to move away from the commission system, which meant very certain things that in early learning. And so I think there would be real heartburn there about calling it, even if you did nothing else but to change the name of the council to the commission, it would send the wrong signals at that level. It's also my advice, without any real force, I did talked to the governor briefly about this, and I can also say he doesn't have strong opinions. He didn't have strong opinions about names, thinks that's a relatively unimportant matter in the grand scheme of things. But our advice at this time is to continue to use the name that of Oregon Education Investment Board, partly for the sake of convenience. It's what people have become used to, while continuing to make the point that, Matt, I think your proposed renaming made, which was that these are not governing boards. And the Oregon Education Investment Board is not a governing board. Nevertheless, we've already printed the T-shirts and made the hats and got the letterhead, and you have a T-shirt?
Yeah, I didn't get one.
You all didn't get T-shirts? All right, check in the office. So, for the sake of kind of continuity there, Oregon Education Investment Board, Early Learning Council, Oregon State Education Council, and I guess we're still playing with it. Higher Education Coordinating Council. I think we could propose, this committee could propose a substructure that is consistent with respect to councils, that maintains consistency with the ELC and its desire to be a council, and then OEIB.
I'm willing to leave this to the committee chair and staff.
I could say of all the discussions to which I want to be party, this isn't one of them.
That's all I wanted to say about it.
I am completely differential on this. I think the point of really wanting to make the emphasize that it's not a governing board. That's the main point.
Yeah.
And so to the extent naming or nomenclature can well, there's two actually. I suppose that's one. And then I do think this alignment of the ELC and the HEC and OSEC with OEIB. I mean, I think we want to really reinforce alignment there, that we're rowing together, and there's ultimate lines of accountability and responsibility. Those are the two. However naming can facilitate those objectives. Otherwise, I'm done.
Great.
Well, this is it. I don't think we missed anything in terms of what the big ticket items are. I think Ben's counsel, and I supported it, was get rid of the matrix for the time being. I think the matrix is going to be a very helpful decision-making tool as we get into more of the details, but really not where this investment board needs to be next week. And so we'll keep the matrix alive and well, and it'll hopefully help us to improve the build out here. But I think at this stage we can leave it out and hopefully move forward with this recommendation. So having gone through it now, before we head to public input, I just want to stop and ask the committee members. I think Julia stepped off, but I want to ask the committee members, are we confident that we can move forward next week as Ben has asked us to? Start with you, Ron.
Well, I'm supportive of it, so I'm happy to take it forward as it is, and whatever fine-tuning you think you're going to do, I agree with Mary and Julia. More than correcting typos, it'd be nice to see it, but we told Seth and a couple people, I will not be able to be at the meeting next week. It's right smack dab the same hours as my big budget meeting in Klamath Falls. But you can certainly communicate my support, and if there's anything I can do in advance of the meeting to communicate that, I'm happy to do that.
Okay. Thanks. Mary?
Just a few things. Generally, yes, but I want to make sure that by agreeing to this, and I think this is what you just said, but I just want to affirm it is not agreeing to this matrix, because I think there are serious problems with this matrix as it relates to community colleges, and there are things that would have to change in here in order for me. So they're disconnected as far as I'm concerned on the matrix. In terms of the graphic itself, I still believe in reflecting number 3 on Objective 7, the ability of OEIB to delegate portions of its responsibilities to sub-councils, that there should be some relationship. And I know you have colors on here, but lots of people don't see, print black and white, they don't see colors. So I think there needs to be some kind of dotted line to OEIB with the Early Learning Council, the OSEC and HEC, to make it clear that these are potentially subconcepts.
Okay, I have about as much energy about that as I do about the naming of the various councils. So I think we're agreeing in principle. I wonder, just lines are, I think, also confusing. Maybe we can accomplish that through a notation down below that, that doesn't rely on color coding.
Yeah, I don't care how it's done, but this needs to be clear to the public about what the relationships are. And this, to me, is not clear except denoted by color, which I don't think that's helpful for transparency about the relationships. Let's see, a couple of comments. On the funding formulas, I think it's good that they're in one place and that there's a connection to need-based aid. I'm assuming that there will be a continuance, whoever is staffing this department, of the methods for developing the funding formulas, which have been very, very collaborative and based in partnership. Let's see. I think I addressed 5. Don't have any problem with the overall functions of the state or OEIB, but again, how those get built out, I think there's a lot of work to be done. I think that on recommendation 6 about the shared services, and we've had this discussion before, so I won't beat it to death. I understand that there's been a lot of discussion about this, but for me, this issue relates to the role of the new post-secondary department and the Chancellor's office. And it's unclear to me why this is so important in a governance discussion when there's a lot of build-out of these departments to happen. And we haven't really, and maybe other people have had conversations about the content and the roles and responsibilities of those departments. But it's not a deal breaker for me, but I just want to underscore that. Yeah, that's it. That's my comments.
Ben, do you have anything you want to add?
I just want to state the obvious, but there's a lot that is not in this recommendation. And just remind folks not to assume that there's more than what you see here. I think even, one of the things that's not here is the relationship between for example, the appointment authority and reporting lines for the between the, for example, head of our Department of Education and the governor and chief education officer. It's not specifically spelled out here. And Matt, you and I had a conversation about this earlier in the week, and I think there just is. This presumes that the entire education enterprise is led by a chief education officer. It doesn't speak, directly to the question of how the various, in this case, 2 agency heads, maybe, division heads, 2 division heads, and a 3rd agency head are appointed. I just to use that to illustrate some of the details that we shouldn't assume are resolved by this. I think they're not difficult to resolve, and I don't point to that one because I think that one in particular is especially difficult. It's just one that occurs to me we haven't dealt with yet here, and we'll need to. I didn't raise that to create any sort of interfere in the process of moving this forward, but rather just to note that some I'd say pretty fundamental questions, we still have some work to do.
Well, whatever the list of things is that aren't resolved here, do you view those as being resolved in years down the line, or those being resolved by the legislature in the spring, filling in the blanks, or how? How do those things that aren't addressed here get addressed?
It very much depends on the issue. I think Matt, for example, has spoken to the fact that the shared services enterprise is in its a very conceptual stage, right? And probably develops and evolves over a series of years. And does it come eventually to be available to K-12 school districts and early learning providers as well? Maybe. Probably not very quickly. On the other hand, questions of the kind of issues of the fundamental architecture of this system, I think we very much want to have resolved before we go to the legislature with a bill. It needs to be in there. Who very clear, and I think this architecture that you're bringing forward to OEIB does that very, very well. I don't want to, at this, even while I'm stressing all the work that hasn't been done, this is a huge piece of work to take it to this point. I mean, this contemplates a very significant shift in the way the state is organized, the way the boards and commissions relate to each other and relate to the agencies, as well as some, on the university side, a very significant shift in the organization of our institutions and their governing boards. So there is a lot expressed in here, but obviously a lot of work still to be done.
That's a pretty short time frame.
Can I ask a question, Ben? Has there been any conversation about the Oregon Workforce Investment Board? Because I noticed that in the post-secondary department, the workforce remains, which I support. But there's another board hanging out there that deals with federal money. So,
where's Dana? Did I answer your question on Monday to your satisfaction on the Workforce Investment Board? If Dana nods, then yes, we've dealt with it.
Don't make me nod.
Basically, the same question was raised on Monday at the summit, and my expectation is that because within the governor's budget, the Department of Post-Secondary would incorporate all of the existing CCWD functions, including workforce ones, it would have a dotted line relationship, if you will, with the Workforce Investment Board as well. That's not on this chart, but it's the assumption that I'm operating under.
okay, thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you, Mary and Ron, and I don't think Julia's back yet to come, and I'll be sure to follow up with her. I have checked, and we do not have any public testimony, so this does conclude our meeting. Yeah. Before we wrap up, I just want to say thank you to fellow committee members to, I think, a very thorough and thoughtful process. Has been said. We did not answer everything. We weren't asked to answer everything. I think we were provided a lot of thoughtful answers to the questions that were posed to us. I want to say thank you.
Matt, can I just say there was some written testimony that was given to us, including something from the Oregon Student Association that actually opposes the creation of, I think, of institutional boards, and they pose a number of questions, and I just wonder about who's going to get back to our student leaders on the issues that they've raised beyond the institutional boards.
I'll take a shot at that. And I have had ongoing discussions with leaders of OSA in the room. And some of these questions are ones that I think this subcommittee's work has attempted to answer, and others are ones that remain yet to be decided, and I think are very important. So those conversations will continue. We hope to work with OSA in the fleshing out of this proposal as it moves from here to the legislature.
Yeah, I would just remind. I think it was at Julia's request last time, recognizing the short time frame here. We did invite written testimony and did so hopefully to inform the discussion that we just had. So I know I read materials from the Chancellor's office as well as OSA, and certainly reflected that in my own thinking. But that has been said, I view this as being a recommendation. We're going to go forward and work through the details, and we'll continue to work with all those stakeholders that submitted input. So, which is a good segue to the next thing I was about to say, which is I also want to, in addition to thanking the committee members, I want to thank everyone in this room and outside this room that contributed. This is we have benefited from a lot of very, very good thinking here over the last couple of weeks, but over the last few months as well. So if there's nothing further, that I look forward to seeing everybody next week, except for Ron. Thanks.